The paper is entitled Jane Hamilton, O.S.A, active 1876 to 1887. Water, sky, trees, shore, a dock, boats. Two boats, a sailboat and a rowboat. Two men rowing to shore. Boats approaching a wharf, date unknown. Watercolor on paper, signed Jane Hamilton, lower left. This watercolor that I have described in a cursory way hangs in my parents' dining room. It was bought on a whim from an antique shop. My mother liked the work. My parents were furnishing the new house with tables, rugs, watercolor, and small oil paintings acquired at auctions and antique shops. It was painted by a woman, she told me, when she and my father brought the work home. I was about 10 or 11 years old when this small watercolor painted by a woman named Jane Hamilton entered our house to be hung beside a large oil painting depicting Roche Percée, painted by F.B. Taylor. My parents were told that the landscape pictured here was the Don River, as it had been in the 19th century. These details were relayed to me, and I accepted them without question. I enjoyed looking at the watercolor, which I did every so often when our family gathered in the dining room for special meals, holidays, birthdays, and other celebrations. I remember ruminating over how different this landscape appeared in comparison to the banks of this river, the same one that I could walk along in the ravine near our house. This area must have been different then. I was satisfied by the statement, it was painted by a woman, and didn't think about who this person might have been. She was an artist. She was Canadian. She had a name, Jane Hamilton, and according to the typed label affixed to the back of the painting, she was active in the Ontario Society of Artists from 1876 to 1887. As I matured, I began to paint using watercolors myself, and I felt a vague affinity with this woman artist. I could now look at this landscape painting with a new appreciation for the skill required to execute this study of 19th century life. It did not occur to me to ask questions of the work or its producer, however, until I was faced with questions posed by the organizers of this conference with regard to the writing of new histories of women and art in Canada. What could I or can I say about Jane Hamilton, the woman who painted this small watercolor? What can I say about the work itself? How might this work add to what historians have to say about the ways in which art and its histories are deployed? What of the fact that this work, painted using watercolor, not oil, and that it was produced by a woman? 30 years after initial feminist interventions into the discipline of art history, scholars who wish to research women's artistic practice have a number of tools and methodologies at their disposal. Yet many are faced with familiar and new challenges by the task of writing women and other minority artists into an expanded cultural history of Canada. By repositioning a work of art that has functioned as a decorative piece in the private sphere, or if you will, my own cultural imaginary, I would like to consider what kinds of questions art historians typically ask when confronted with a historical work of art, while also addressing some other questions of our discipline. Feminist art historians and critics have explored the ways that art historical institutions and discourses have shaped the dynamics that continually subordinate work produced by women. Scholars have examined women's lives as artists in the context of debates about the relationship between gender, culture, and creativity. Feminist investigations in the discipline in the early 1970s attempted to reclaim women's histories and to reinstitute women within a history of cultural production. This led to an emphasis on the idea of female creativity, which would be revealed by stripping away layers of patriarchal culture and conditioning. Attention was also drawn to the primary categories of art historical analysis, art and artists, through which knowledge is structured. Art history emphasizes style, attribution, dating, authenticity, and the rediscovery and re-evaluation of forgotten artists. Early feminist interventions challenged art history's constructed categories, and in particular, the reverence for the individual male artist as genius. Their work also demonstrated how sexual difference has been inscribed in both the objects of study and also in the terms through which they are interpreted and discussed. As Lisa Tickner and others have argued, the production of meaning is inseparable from the production of power. So we may understand that, quote, feminism, a political ideology addressed to relations of power, and art history, or any discourse productive of knowledge, are more intimately connected than is popularly supposed, end quote. Feminist analysis and interventions have raised important questions about the categories within which cultural objects are arranged and analyzed. art history has structured its study of cultural artifacts within particular categories, privileging some forms of cultural production over others and continually valuing certain kinds of objects and the individuals who have produced them. More recent developments in the field have been inflected by theoretical arguments and approaches including structuralism, psychoanalysis, and semiology. Scholarly work that is theoretically informed marks a shift away from analyses that focus primarily on rethinking the categories of art and artists to consider broader issues with regard to ideologies of gender, sexuality, and power. As Michael Ann Hawley has stated, whatever the methodological framework, the typical art historical enterprise is characterized by, quote, a compulsion to recover a certain something long since forgotten or lost, end quote. Art historians are interested in and value the same things as historians concerned with past events. We investigate what is no longer here and no longer seen. We ask questions of the work's provenance, of the artists who made it, and consider the conditions of production and or display. Establishing provenance and authenticating the work of art by attributing it to the hand of an artist of whom certain information is known has long since been the task of the connoisseur. Connoisseurship, in turn, can be understood as the foundation for object-based art history. Yet this method of inquiry has largely fallen out of favor for a variety of reasons, and since I am interested in matters that extend beyond the materiality of the painted surface, I want to think about issues and raise questions with regard to gender and representation. What is more, connoisseurship is tightly bound to the art market. The task of authenticating the work, attributing it to a specific artist, and locating information concerning the work's provenance all serve the purpose of appraisal, so that the work may be sold to art collectors or institutions. This watercolor by Jane Hamilton poses a number of challenges if one were to apply the methods of connoisseurial practice to an analysis of this particular work of art. Although I am not averse to producing a detailed formal analysis of this painting, a task that is a necessary step for the connoisseur, would this aid in illuminating issues with regard to social context as well as answering questions about the artist herself? What information exists with regard to Jane Hamilton? Can I examine Hamilton's relationship to dominant modes of production or to a nascent art community in Ontario in the 19th or early 20th century? What other paintings might I analyze this watercolor against? Thus far, I have not successfully located another work by this artist. First, something of the artist and her body of work would need to be known in order to study this work for details that reveal information about the artist's style. Little information is available to undertake such an analysis. Archival research yields little in the way of additional information about this artist. Jane Hamilton appears in the Ontario Society of Artists Fall only once in a file regarding the history of the O.S.A. and related exhibitions, 1878 to 1915. Here I learned that the information affixed to the back of boats approaching a wharf is incorrect. Oops. Oh, no, I totally messed it up. Thank you. Okay. There. According to the chronological list of the members of the Ontario Society of Artists from the Foundation, 1872, I learned that a Mrs. J. Hamilton became a member on the 1st of February, 1876, and dropped her membership 2 years later in 1878. I learned nothing else of this woman, her work as a painter, who she was, or why she dropped her membership. Her work is not listed in any of the records documenting early exhibitions of the members of the Society, and it seems there is no other trace of this woman to be found in the history of the O.S.A. or the history of Canadian art more generally. Nor does Jane Hamilton appear in the CWAHI artist database. All I know is that Mr. H. Hancock moved to elect Mrs. J. Hamilton as a member of the Ontario Society of Artists in the capacity of painter on the 1st of February, 1876. Although Jane Hamilton was, briefly, a member of the Ontario Society of Artists, her work does not form part of the Government of Ontario art collection. Established in 1855 as the first publicly funded art collection in the country, much of the early collection comes from work purchased by Reverend Egerton Ryerson. Ryerson's goal was specifically oriented to encourage the fine arts in Upper Canada, and the work that he purchased was acquired on his grand tour of Europe in 1885 and 1886. Much of Ryerson's collection consists of copies of paintings of old masters. Although Hamilton's watercolor was likely produced after the establishment of the Government of Ontario Art Collection, which does contain work by members of the Ontario Society of Artists purchased by the government from the annual O.S.A. exhibitions, her work does not appear to form part of the significant collection of early works produced by Canadian artists. Perhaps the subject matter or the medium explains why Hamilton's work was not significant enough to be included in the public art collection. If copies of work produced by old masters or similar work that was associated with historically significant schools was what was valued, Hamilton's scene of contemporary rural life in Ontario may not have been prized in a similar manner. Given that I am unaware of other paintings that Hamilton produced in the late 19th century, assuming that this watercolor was produced around the time she held her O.S.A. membership, it is unclear how one might value or assess her work. As a watercolor depicting rural life, or perhaps a scene of leisure, boats approaching a wharf can be classed as either genre painting, where a recreational scene is depicted in a realistic manner, or simply as landscape painting. What of the choice of medium? The painting is a watercolor, and art history tends to view watercolor as a modern phenomenon. Practiced by professionals and amateurs, watercolor resisted contemporary categorization and cohesive analysis during the late 19th century. Was this choice of medium an indication that Jane Hamilton was what one would call a Sunday painter? During the 19th century, there was a growing ideology of domesticity that linked women to a specific set of roles. Needlework and painting were considered appropriate pastimes for women at this time. What may be considered the first generation of professional women artists in North America trained abroad during the 1850s and 1860s. It was common for art students who were women and whose families supported their aspirations to travel to Europe to study drawing and painting in established academies that would accept women as students. Was Jane Hamilton part of what may be understood as the first generation of professional Canadian women artists? If so, where was she trained? There was a passing hint in the archives that she may have studied in Paris, but I have been unable to confirm this. Did she learn painting at home? Bearing in mind that a Mrs. J. Hamilton is listed as painter in the O.S.A. membership in 1876, we can assume that the artist had to negotiate domestic responsibilities in addition to her practice as a painter. Was watercolor painting something that respectable society ladies were encouraged to do? In other words, was this a pastime for Jane Hamilton, or did she see herself as a serious professional artist? Presumably she did, which would explain why she sought to join the Ontario Society of Artists in 1876. What more can this watercolor tell us? When the painting was purchased, we were told the scene was of the Don River. Yet the body of water looks to be too large to be the mouth of the Don River, at the point at which it empties into Lake Ontario. However, given the amount of landfill since the late 19th century, it is possible that it is indeed the locale. But the scene could be a dock on any lake, presumably though not certainly in rural Ontario. It appears that the work was painted en plein air, from a vantage point that was close to the water's shore. Perhaps the artist was seated on a nearby wharf, or it is also possible that the artist was herself in a boat. The shoreline looks rugged, as dense trees and fallen logs populate the lower right corner of the picture. Plain. Clouds hang in the sky. Figures, perhaps women, are barely discernible on the dock in the center of the composition. A flag flies at the edge of the wharf by the water. Two men row a boat to shore. The scene, with its focus on the expanse of water and boats approaching the shore, is one of pastoral tranquility. By describing the watercolor painted by Jane Hamilton, something of how this painting functions as representation can be understood. I can appreciate that this is a representation of a scene that is absolutely singular, and that it is formed by specific configurations of historical time and place. In the absence of detailed information pertaining to the artist or this painting, I must rely on visual analysis to recognize and understand the visual choices Jane Hamilton made in creating this watercolor. It is clear, however, that the scene was executed with considerable skill and shows good command of the chosen medium. I was not able to find anything more than a trace of the artist Jane Hamilton in the archival holdings pertaining to the Ontario Society of Artists, and consequently I am faced with a common challenge of writing women's histories in the absence of any real, concrete biographical information. I do not know whether Jane Hamilton was a trained painter or whether she faced similar challenges to other women who embarked on professional careers as artists in the late 19th century. I assume that, like many women of her time who sought a life beyond the confines of the domestic sphere, Jane Hamilton was confronted by circumscribed views of femininity. What we can say is that she sought and obtained professional standing by admission to the O.S.A, and that she exercised considerable skill in creating a watercolor landscape, possibly en plein air. When faced with the challenge of missing information, we must work in contrast to the model of art historical scholarship, where the artist is viewed as a subject who creates meaning, which in turn can be interpreted by the art historian with recourse to the artist's biography. Attempts must be made to explore the kinds of readings that are made possible by artwork in light of missing information. The discipline of art history has always aimed to take the relationship between particular works of art and their individual beholders as the field's primary object of study. We must consider that what we actually see and experience when confronted with a historical work of art. Yet the fact remains that absent additional biographical information or the discovery of a further body of work, I have reached an impasse. Using the traditional methods of biography/archive and the connoisseur reaches a dead end. Is there no way to get women artists like Jane Hamilton off the wall and into the narrative? My doctoral research on women at the margins of the interwar period in France, Germany, and Canada suggests there may be. There I find striking parallels to my case study of Jean Memon, an artist and illustrator of Weimar, Germany. Memon's watercolor illustrations of the New Frau, or New Woman, were widely circulated in her own day, but have received scant attention since. Moreover, when the archive in Berlin devoted her life and work prefers to promote other aspects of her oeuvre. By framing her work within feminist discourse of marginality and especially by examining gender bias against the genre of fashion illustration, I was able to demonstrate the political and social critique embedded in her work that was on par with her more famous contemporaries such as Georges Gaulle. A similar analysis needs to be made for issues of gender and the genre of watercolor in the late 19th century, not only in Canada but more comparatively. The case of Jane Hamilton reinforces the notion expressed by feminist scholars that it is not sufficient to recover women and insert them into the dominant narratives. Our task is to change the narratives themselves. That will be the only way to encompass the contributions of women such as Jane Hamilton, who do not occupy a place in the archives or the narratives of art history in the writing of an expanded history of Canadian art.